Have you ever been driving through different parts of the country, flicking through the radio, and you notice something kind of strange? A lot of the local stations, they all sound, well, exactly the same. Yeah, that's not an accident. It's actually the result of this incredible 50-year journey that totally reshaped the sound of the UK. So let's unpack that story through the life of one pioneering station that went from being a city's best friend to just another stop on a national network.
Okay, just look at this. This one slide says it all, really. On the left, you've got Radio Hallam's original slogan from the 70s, "Your friendly set." It's warm, it's personal, it sounds like a neighbor you'd chat with over the fence. Now look to the right, it's 2024's successor. The biggest hits, the biggest throwbacks. It's slick, it's all about the music, and honestly, it could be for any city, anywhere in the country. This single comparison right here captures the entire transformation we're about to get into.
So the big question is, how did we get from there to here? What were the forces that turned a unique, local voice into a national brand? Well, to really understand that, we have to rewind the clock, back to a time before commercial radio was even a thing in the UK.
Seriously, before the early 1970s, if you turned on your radio in the UK, your choices were, well, let's just say they were incredibly limited. The airwaves were pretty much controlled by one single dominant voice.
For decades, the BBC had a total monopoly. That was it. But by the 1960s, people were getting hungry for something different. And that hunger was being fed by these rebellious offshore pirate radio stations, literally broadcasting pop music from ships out in international waters. They proved there was this huge audience just desperate for an alternative.
And what's really fascinating here is just how fast things started to change once the ball got rolling. The pirates basically forced the BBC's hand, which gave us Radio 1. But the real game changer? That was the 1972 Sound Broadcasting Act. It officially broke the monopoly and allowed for the creation of something new, independent local radio, or ILR. A brand new era of broadcasting was about to begin.
And this is where our main character comes in. Radio Hallam in Sheffield. It launched in October 1974, and it was the perfect example of this new wave. Its leader, Keith Skews, was a true radio pioneer. I mean, the guy was a veteran of both the pirate station Radio Caroline and the BBC. He brought a whole team of BBC rebels with him, all of them chomping at the bit to create something totally new and, most importantly, uniquely local.
But here's the part of the story that's so interesting it's almost ironic. The very regulations that were designed to control these news stations, well, they accidentally created their golden age. The rules actually forced them to be incredibly creative, and in doing that, they became deeply, deeply connected to their communities.
This quote from the head regulator at the time, wow, it says everything about the original idea. They didn't want these stations to just be seen as commercial money-making machines. The key words, the important ones, were independent and local. The mission was more like public service, just funded by ads, not simply selling airtime to the highest bidder.
And the most crucial rule behind all this was something called needle time. Basically, because of music copyright rules, stations had a really strict limit on how many hours of records they could play. Today that sounds absolutely crazy, right? But back then, it meant they had to fill hours and hours and hours of airtime with something else. And that something else had to be local speech.
And this is what that actually sounded like. Radio Hallam was making award-winning documentaries on serious local issues like alcoholism. They purposefully ran their local news at 5 minutes to the hour so they wouldn't clash with the BBC's national news on the hour. And their presenters, they weren't just faceless voices. They were local personalities that listeners felt like they actually knew. This wasn't just a playlist of songs. It was the city talking to itself.
But, as you can probably guess, that golden age couldn't last forever. By the 1980s, you had these growing economic pressures, a changing political climate, and suddenly the radio stations were in a direct conflict with the very regulator that had helped shape their unique sound. The push for profit was starting to win out over the push for public service.
You can pretty much pinpoint the moment the tide started to turn to a single year, 1984. This was when the industry basically decided it was time to fight back against the old way of doing things.
So get this, a secret meeting was held. The heads of all the major stations, they got together without the regulator and decided to challenge the whole system. They argued that these strict rules were holding them back financially and that they needed the freedom to operate in a much more commercial, free market kind of way.
And this push, well, it found a very receptive audience in the government at the time. The result was the massive Broadcasting Act of 1990. It completely changed the game. It replaced all those strict local requirements with what they called an open market approach. And just like that, the doors to consolidation and networking were thrown wide open.
With those new rules in place, the path was suddenly clear for the bigger companies to start buying up all the smaller, independent stations. The network takeover had officially begun.
The change started happening almost immediately. Mergers became the new normal. In fact, in 1986, even before the new act, Hallam merged with other Yorkshire stations. Now at first, they kept their local names, but they started sharing some evening and weekend shows. It was just more efficient, more economical. The focus was slowly but surely shifting from what made a station unique to what made it profitable.
You can see this whole process play out perfectly just by looking at the history of Radio Hallam's sister AM station. Check out the name changes. Classic Gold, then Magic, then Hallam 2, and finally, Greatest Hits Radio. Each one of those rebrands represents another step away from a local identity and one step closer to a generic national network brand.
This became known as the salami slicing of local radio. It happened bit by bit, so maybe you wouldn't even notice at first. First, the overnight shows were networked from London or Manchester, then the evenings, then weekend afternoons. For years and years, the last bastion of localism was the breakfast show. But eventually, for so many stations, even that was replaced by a national program.
And that brings us to the final chapter of this story, the complete absorption of the local station into a fully fledged national brand. Not just in its sound, but in its name too.
This table, man, it just lays it all out there, doesn't it? In 2024, the name Radio Hallam, a Sheffield institution for nearly 50 years, was retired. The programming became almost entirely national, and maybe most tellingly, the local Sheffield studios were closed. The transformation was officially complete.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, it was a trade-off. The distinct, sometimes quirky, and deeply local character of hundreds of individual stations was exchanged for the commercial efficiency and the polished sound of just a handful of major national brands. There's really no right or wrong here, but it is so important to understand what was gained and what was lost in the process.
Which leaves all of us with one final big question. In today's media landscape totally dominated by global streaming services and podcasts on every topic you could possibly imagine, is there still a place for a truly local voice? And if there is, what does that local sound of the future even sound like?